The final slam of the oak door sounded like a judge's gavel. It was the sound of a life ending. 19-year-old Elada stood on the porch of the house she had been born in, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, the only things that hadn't been cast out with her. Inside, her uncle Thaddeus, his blacksmith's arms thick with self-righteousness, was now master of the hearth, the fields, and the future. Her father's death had been sudden, a fever that stole the breath from his lungs in less than a week. The will, read by the town clerk just an hour ago, was a cruel formality. Thaddeus, as the only male heir, received the farm, the livestock, the tools, everything of value. To Elada, his niece, he was instructed to provide fair consideration. Thaddeus's version of fairness was a small, clinking pouch of coins and a folded deed, pressed into her palm with a heavy sigh that was meant to convey deep sorrow, but landed as pure theater.
"It is all I can do, my dear," he had said, his voice echoing in the silent parlor. "Your father, in a moment of whimsy, bought this parcel up in the high country. It's worthless, of course, a rock pile, but it is land. It is yours. A start." It was not a start. It was an exile, gift wrapped in legal paper. She looked down at her inheritance. 10 silver dollars. A deed for a plot of land known only as the Fissure, a place so barren and windswept that even trappers avoided it. She had the clothes on her back, a faded cotton dress ill-suited for the coming autumn. And she had Ronan, her father's dog, a great shaggy beast of indeterminate breed, whose gray-muzzled head now rested loyally against her knee. He was the only part of her old life that had followed her out the door. The town of Providence watched her departure. They were not unkind, but their pity was a heavy blanket. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town's mercantile, stopped her as she passed his storefront. He was a man whose wisdom was measured in sacks of flour and barrels of nails. "Elada," he said, his voice low and full of practical concern, "that land is a ghost. Thaddeus has done you a deep wrong. Take my advice. Sell me that deed for $5, add it to what you have, and buy a coach ticket east. A girl like you can find work in a kitchen. It's an honest life." She looked at his earnest, weathered face and saw the sensible path laid out before her. A path of servitude and forgetting, a path that accepted defeat. Something cold and hard set itself in her chest, a stone of defiance she didn't know she possessed. "Thank you, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "But the land is mine." He shook his head slowly, a sad, knowing gesture. "Don't let your father's pride be your undoing, child." She did not buy a ticket. Instead, she walked into his store, Ronan at her heels. The 10 silver dollars felt impossibly heavy and light at the same time. She did not buy food, or a warm coat, or a blanket. She laid her coins on the smooth, worn wood of the counter. "I need my father's axe," she said. Thaddeus had claimed it, but she knew it was in the back for sharpening. And a pickaxe, a shovel, and a 20-pound sack of salt. Mr. Gable stared, his mouth slightly agape. He sold her the tools, his movements slow with disbelief. The heavy implements felt strange and powerful in her hands. As she turned to leave, she paused. "And a small bag of rye seeds." With her last few coins, she made the final, most foolish purchase of all. She turned her back on the silent, watching faces of Providence, on the pity and the sensible advice. With Ronan beside her, she began the long walk toward the high, empty hills, toward the worthless land that was now her entire world. The journey was a punishment. The path dwindled from a wagon-rutted track to a faint deer trail, then to nothing at all. The gentle, rolling fields around Providence gave way to steep, rock-strewn slopes dotted with skeletal pines.
The air grew thin and sharp, and the wind was a constant thief, stealing the warmth from her skin and the breath from her lungs. She carried the heavy heads of the axe and pickaxe, the shovel haft digging into her shoulder. Ronan scouted ahead, his massive form a reassuring presence in the vast, indifferent landscape. For 2 days she walked, sleeping fitfully in the lee of boulders, wrapped in her thin shawl, with the dog's body pressed against her for warmth. The world she had known, the smell of baking bread, the chime of the church bell, the lowing of cattle, vanished behind her. Out here, the only sounds were the wind whistling through rock and the cry of a lone hawk circling in the pale, empty sky. She found the fissure on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Her heart, which had been buoyed by the grim rhythm of walking, sank into a cold, dark place in her gut. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not a gentle hollow or a defensible ravine. It was a violent scar in the face of a granite cliff, a jagged crack that plunged into darkness, choked at its mouth with a chaotic jumble of fallen rock and thorny, dead brush. It looked like the mountain had been struck by a hateful god, and this was the wound. This was her inheritance. A grave. Ilara dropped the tools. The clang of metal on stone was a lonely, final sound. She sank to her knees, the sharp edges of the scree digging into her skin. The town was right. Thaddeus was right. Mr. Gable was right. She was a fool, undone by a sliver of pride she couldn't afford. Tears she had refused to shed on her father's passing or on her own expulsion now came, hot and stinging in the cold air. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. Ronan whined softly and licked the salt from her cheek, his own form of comfort. She sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip toward the jagged horizon, feeling the temperature drop with alarming speed. The wind picked up, a relentless, scouring force that seemed to want to peel her from the mountainside. It whipped around the corner of the cliff and hit her like a physical blow. Shivering, she huddled closer to Ronan, trying to find shelter in his thick fur. And that was when she felt it. Or rather, what she didn't feel. The wind screamed past the mouth of the fissure, but where she sat, just a few feet inside the opening, the air was almost perfectly still. It was a pocket of profound calm in the midst of the gale. Curiosity, a fragile instinct she thought had died in her, stirred. She stood up, her muscles stiff with cold and sorrow, and took a tentative step deeper into the crack. The air changed. The biting cold of the wind-blasted evening was replaced by a cool, but not frigid, stillness. It was the difference between a knife's edge and a block of ice. She reached out a hand and laid it flat against the granite wall. It was cold, yes, but it was the deep, neutral cold of the earth, not the sharp, aggressive frost of the air outside. The rock seemed to hold a memory of the day's meager warmth. It was a thermal mass, a vast stone battery. She took another step into the gloom. The fissure narrowed and then twisted, cutting off the last of the dying light. Here, in the absolute darkness, the stillness was even more profound. And she heard it, a sound so faint she had to hold her breath to be sure. Drip, drip, drip. It was a slow, steady, and impossibly vital sound. Water. Clean water, seeping from the heart of the mountain itself. Despair did not vanish in a triumphant wave. It receded, slowly, like a grudging tide, replaced by something else. A grim, hard-bitten resolve that settled deep in her bones. The town saw a worthless hole. Her uncle saw a grave. But the mountain had a secret. This was not a wound. It was a shelter. The work began at dawn. It was a battle fought with her hands, her back, and the few tools she possessed. The first task was to clear the entrance. The fissure was choked with a century of debris. She used the pickaxe to loosen the impacted soil and rocks, the shovel to heave them away, and her own raw hands to drag out the thorny carcasses of dead bushes. Her palms, soft from a life of domestic chores, were a geography of pain within hours. Blisters rose, broke, and bled, leaving weeping patches of raw skin that stung with every grip. Ronan, sensing the shift in her, seemed to understand his role. When she wrestled with a heavy, dead branch, he would seize the other end in his powerful jaws and pull, his low growls a testament to his effort. Together, they slowly, painfully, cleared a space deep enough for her to stand upright, a space that was fully protected from the wind. Her next task was a wall. The fissure offered 3 sides of impenetrable granite, but the front was open to the world. She needed to close it. She spent days hauling stones from the scree field at the base of the cliff, her muscles screaming in protest. She chose the flattest ones she could find, her arms aching with the strain of lifting and carrying. She had watched stonemasons in Providence, and she tried to mimic their work, fitting the stones together like pieces of a crude puzzle, filling the larger gaps with smaller shards of rock. But the wall was just a pile of loose stones until she could bind it. She needed mortar. She remembered her father talking about old-timers using clay and grass. Following the sound of the dripping water deep into the fissure, her only light a flickering torch made from a resinous pine branch, she found the source. A steady seep from a crack in the ceiling collected in a small pool. Around the pool, the ground was thick with heavy, gray clay. She spent a day digging it out with her shovel, hauling it back to the entrance in clumsy handfuls. She mixed it with water, sand, and dried grasses she gathered from a more sheltered meadow below the cliff. The resulting plaster was thick and sticky. Painfully, slowly, she began to chink the gaps in her wall, packing the mud-like mixture into every crevice with her bare, blistered hands. It was ugly, primitive work, but as it dried, it hardened like stone. The wind, which had whistled through the gaps, was silenced. She left an opening for a door and a small, square hole for a window. Then she turned her attention to the trees. The slopes below the cliff held a sparse forest of hardy pine and aspen. Her father had taught her how to use his axe, how to read the lean of a tree and make the cuts clean and true. Felling the first tree was a terrifying, exhilarating act. The crack and groan of the wood, the thunderous crash as it fell. It was a sound of profound change. Getting the logs up the slope to her fissure was a new kind of agony. She would cut them into manageable lengths, then drag them, one by one, her body straining, Ronan pulling alongside her, harnessed with a rope she'd plaited from vines. These logs became the frame for her door, the lintel above her window, and the beams for a small, lean-to roof she built against the rock face just outside the main wall, creating a covered space to store firewood. The greatest discovery came when she was exploring the dark, narrow passages that branched off the main fissure. While planning her hearth, she worried about smoke filling her living space. But as she held a torch aloft in one of the smaller side cracks, she saw the flame flicker and the smoke pull steadily upwards. She followed the crack as it snaked into the rock above her. It was a natural chimney, a flue carved by geology, venting somewhere high on the cliff face. With renewed energy, she built her hearth directly below it, a careful arrangement of flat stones. The moment she lit the first fire was a turning point. The kindling caught, the flames licked at the larger logs, and the smoke, instead of billowing out into the cave, drew perfectly up the hidden fissure and vanished. The fire did more than provide warmth. It pushed back the profound, oppressive darkness of the rock. It made the cave a home. The granite walls, which had been cold to the touch, slowly began to absorb the heat. Hours after the fire was banked to embers, the stone itself radiated a gentle, constant warmth, turning the entire shelter into a slow-release oven. Her water system was simple but effective. She enlarged the natural basin beneath the seep with her pickaxe, then lined the entire hollow with a thick layer of the gray clay, smoothing it with wet hands and letting it dry into a waterproof cistern. The slow, steady drip kept it perpetually full of cold, clean water. But she knew shelter, fire, and water were not enough. She needed a sustainable source of food, and more importantly, a way to survive the winter to come. She needed livestock. And for livestock, she needed a pen safe from the predators of the high country. A wooden fence would be useless against wolves or a mountain lion. The answer, she knew, was the rock itself. She chose another side passage, one that dead-ended after 20 feet, and she began to dig. This was the most brutal labor of all. The rock and impacted earth were dense, unforgiving. Using the pickaxe to break the material loose and the shovel to haul it out, she slowly hollowed out a chamber, a subterranean room connected to her living space. It was dark, windowless, and utterly protected. The work took weeks. Her body became a thing of sinew and raw will. She grew thinner, but her arms and back hardened with muscle. When the chamber was large enough, she walked back to Providence. Her arrival caused a stir. The girl who had walked into the wilderness was gaunt and weathered, her hands calloused and scarred, her dress stained with dirt and clay. But her eyes held a new light, a quiet fire of determination that unsettled those who had pitied her. She ignored the whispers and the stares. She walked to a farm on the edge of town where a man sold sheep. With the last of her silver, she bought 3 pregnant ewes. The farmer looked at her, then at the coins, and shook his head. "The wolves will have these before the first snow, girl. This is a waste of good money." "The pen is secure," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. Leading 3 stubborn sheep on a rope through the wilderness was a trial of patience and strength. Ronan proved his worth, expertly herding the animals, nipping at their heels to keep them moving, and standing guard when they rested. The town watched her go, a strange, lonely parade of 1 girl, 1 dog, and 3 sheep, heading for a hole in a rock. It was then the nickname was born, whispered first in the mercantile, then spoken openly in the street. Fissure Girl. It was a name meant to mock, to describe the absurdity of her endeavor. Back at the fissure, she settled the ewes into their new home. The underground pen was dry and, warmed by the ambient heat of the mountain and the animals' own bodies, surprisingly comfortable. She carved a trough into a long stone and kept it filled with water from her cistern. She had her small flock. She had her fortress of rock. Now, all that was left was to endure. Brant was the first to bring the mockery to her door. He was the valley's most successful sheep rancher, a man whose wealth was counted in hoof and fleece. He rode a fine horse, and the condescension dripped from him like rain from a saddle blanket. He found her one afternoon as she was cutting firewood, and he reined in his horse, looking from her to the crude stone wall sealing the fissure. "Heard the stories," he called down, not bothering to dismount. "Didn't believe 'em. Fissure Girl." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You truly mean to keep sheep inside a cave?" Ellada paused, leaning on her axe. She said nothing. "The damp will get in their lungs, girl," he said, gesturing with a gloved hand. "They'll be coughing their lives out by midwinter. And what happens when you let them out to graze? A wolf will see them from a mile off against this rock. You're ringing a dinner bell. You're a fool." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her feet, wheeled his horse around, and galloped away, his laughter echoing against the cliffs. His words were like stones, and for a day they weighed her down with doubt. Was he right? Was this all a massive, life-threatening mistake? But that night, as a cold rain swept through the high country, She sat by her fire, the warmth of the rock at her back. She could hear the soft, contented shuffling of the ewes in their subterranean pen, completely dry and sheltered from the storm. Ronan slept at her feet, his tail thumping softly in a dream. The world outside could rage, but in here, in the world she had built with her own 2 hands, there was peace. Brant was wrong. The town was wrong. Winter arrived not as a gentle blanket, but as a thrown fist. The sky turned the color of lead, and the snow came, driven by a wind that howled like a hungry animal. The world outside her fissure vanished into a swirling vortex of white. For Ilara, life shrank to a series of simple, vital rhythms. Her day began before dawn, in the deep, silent dark of the cave. She would stir the embers of the fire, add a new log, and wait for the warmth to fill the space. Her first task was always the animals. She would take her lantern into the underground pen, the air thick with the warm, earthy smell of sheep and hay. She would check on the ewes, their bellies swollen with the promise of spring lambs, fill their water trough, and give them a small ration of the oats she'd carefully preserved. They were calm, healthy, their wool thick and clean. Brant's prediction of lung rot was proving to be a fiction. The air in the cave was cool and dry, not damp. Next was her own water and food. She would fetch water from the cistern, the steady drip, 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 a constant, reassuring heartbeat in the heart of the mountain. Her meals were sparse, a thin stew made from salted meat and the rye she ground into a coarse flour between 2 stones. The isolation was absolute. Weeks went by without the sight of another human being, without a voice other than her own, humming softly to herself. The silence was a physical presence, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the bleating of the sheep, and Ronan's deep, rumbling snores. She was utterly alone, but for the first time in her life, she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of this small, warm kingdom of stone and fire. The winter offered smaller tests that hardened her resolve. A pack of coyotes, gaunt with hunger, found her dwelling. They circled for 2 nights, their yips and howls echoing off the cliffs. Ronan stood silent guard at the door, the fur on his back ridged, a low growl, a constant vibration in his chest. They could smell the sheep, but they could not get to them. Eventually, they moved on. Later, a heavy melt followed by a snap freeze caused a minor rockfall, partially blocking the entrance. She spent 2 days with her shovel and pick, methodically clearing the rubble, her body aching but her spirit undeterred. Each challenge overcome was another layer of proof. Her systems were working. She was surviving. Then came the wolf winter. It started with a cold so deep and profound that trees split open with a sound like rifle shots. The air was painful to breathe. Then the snow returned, but this was different. It was a blizzard of unprecedented fury, a physical assault on the world. The wind did not howl, it screamed. And with the storm came the wolves. They were driven down from the highest peaks, a massive pack, their hunger making them fearless. They were legends made real, gray ghosts that moved through the blinding snow. The Valley of Providence, which had felt so secure in its wooden barns and fenced pastures, became a hunting ground. The conventional structures of the town were useless. The wolves were too numerous, too intelligent. They leaped 6-foot fences as if they were stepping stones. They dug under barn walls with frantic energy. The nights in the valley were filled with terror, the panicked bleating of sheep, the high-pitched screams of dying animals, and the triumphant howls of the pack. Farmers stood guard with rifles, but their shots were lost in the swirling snow, their targets fleeting shadows. Brant's farm was the first to be hit, and the hardest. His vast flock, the source of his pride and wealth, was penned in sprawling wooden corrals. The pack descended on them in a coordinated slaughter. In a single, bloody night, his life's work was annihilated. The story was the same across the valley. Roofs of barns collapsed under the weight of the snow, trapping and killing the animals within. Firewood supplies, meant to last a normal winter, dwindled at an alarming rate against the unprecedented cold. The community's confidence, built on generations of tradition and sturdy lumber, shattered like ice. In her fissure, Elara was a spectator to the chaos. She could hear the distant, terrifying sounds carried on the wind. Ronan spent the nights pacing before the heavy door, a constant, low growl in his throat. The wolves came to her mountain. She could hear them outside, their claws scratching against the stone wall, their howls echoing in the night. They could smell the lingering scent of her presence, but the tons of granite above her sheep pen masked the scent of the flock. Her animals were deep underground, safe and silent, oblivious to the massacre happening just beyond their stone sanctuary. Her fire burned steady. Her water dripped into the cistern. Her sheep chewed their cud in the warm, dark safety of their stone room. The systems she had built, the systems born of desperation and mocked as foolishness, were holding. She was not fighting the storm or the wolves. She was simply outside their reach. The banging on her door came in the deepest, darkest hour of the blizzard's third night. It was a frantic, desperate sound, nearly lost in the shriek of the wind. Ronan erupted in a furious volley of barks, his body rigid. Elara grabbed a heavy piece of firewood as a club, her heart pounding. No one should be out in this. No one could be. She pulled back the heavy bar she had fitted across the door and opened it a crack. A figure, caked in snow and ice, stumbled forward and collapsed into her shelter. It was Brant. His face was a mask of frozen despair, his fine winter coat torn, his rifle gone. He was shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from sheer, soul-crushing shock. "They're gone," he choked out, his words ragged clouds of vapor in the warm air of the cave. All of them. Every last one. He had been out, making a final, hopeless stand when he saw it. A faint, impossible orange glow high on the cliff face. The vent of her natural chimney. He had stumbled toward it as his last, dying hope. He fell to his knees on her earthen floor, a broken man. And in that moment, Elara saw him not as her tormentor, but as the embodiment of the entire community that had cast her out, laughed at her, and left her for dead. Here he was, the symbol of their pride and their certainty, destroyed by the very forces she had prepared for. The bitter memory of his laughter, of the name Fisher Girl, rose in her mind. It would be so easy to turn him out, to let the wind and the wolves have him, to claim a victory that was rightfully hers. But as she looked at his shaking form, she didn't feel triumph. She felt only the deep, quiet strength of the mountain around her. To turn him away would be to become as cruel as the winter. It would be to deny the very principle on which she had built her new life, that survival was not about beating others, but about enduring. Without a word, she closed the door, shutting out the screaming wind. She put another log on the fire. The moral choice was not a choice at all. It was simply who she had become. She had to help him, not because he deserved it, but because she could. She put a hand on his shoulder and gently guided him closer to the warmth of the hearth. As the warmth began to seep into his frozen limbs, Brant slowly looked around. His eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, took in the scene. He saw the neat stack of firewood, the smooth, clay-lined cistern brimming with clear water, the shelves carved into the rock holding jars of dried herbs and salted meat. He felt the profound, penetrating warmth radiating from the stone walls. It was a place of order, of preparation, of impossible security in the middle of a world that had come undone. Then he heard it, a faint, calm sound from deeper within the rock. The soft bleating of a sheep, followed by the shuffling of hooves. It was a sound of life, a sound he thought he would never hear again. He stared at Ilara, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning awe. "How?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "The wolves. They took everyone's flock. I saw them. They are devils." Ilara didn't offer a long explanation. She simply picked up her lantern and gestured with her head toward the dark passage that led to the pen. She walked down it, and after a moment's hesitation, he followed. She held the lantern high, and the light fell upon the ewes, resting peacefully on a bed of dry grass, their wool thick and unstained by fear or weather. One of them looked up, her dark eyes placid. Brant stared, unable to comprehend. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the rough stone wall of the pen. It was solid, immovable. "They're underground," he said, the words more a realization than a question. The staggering simplicity of it broke him. All his sturdy fences, his big barns, his years of experience, all of it had been useless. He had fought the wilderness on its own terms and been annihilated. This girl, this child he had mocked, had not fought it. She had burrowed into it, made a pact with the stone, and had been granted sanctuary. He turned to look at her, a girl half his age, standing there in the lantern light, her face calm and serious. The full weight of his arrogance, of the town's collective, smug certainty, crashed down upon him. "My God," he breathed, the words heavy with shame. "We called you Fisher Girl. We called you a fool." He looked at his frost-bitten hands, then back at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. We were the fools. It was the moment of her greatest triumph, the complete and total vindication of her struggle. And Ilara said nothing. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind him of his cruelty. She did not gloat. Her victory was the warmth of the cave, the safety of her sheep, the steady beat of her own heart. It needed no announcement. She simply turned and led him back to the main fire. She ladled some of her meager stew into a bowl and handed it to him. "There is food," she said. "Eat." In the face of his shame, she offered not judgment, but sustenance. Her quiet grace was a more powerful statement than any words of triumph could ever be. When the great blizzard finally broke and a pale, watery sun emerged, the valley below was a scene of devastation. The snow was littered with the dark, frozen shapes of dead livestock. Providence was a town in mourning, its economic lifeblood drained away in a few short nights. The wolf winter had broken them. Brant returned to the town a changed man. He told everyone what he had seen. He spoke of the impossible warmth of the stone fissure, the cleverness of the natural chimney, and the simple, genius idea of an underground pen. He spoke of the girl who had not only saved her own flock, but had saved his life, and had done so with a quiet dignity that shamed him to his core. Slowly, cautiously, people began to make the long trek up to the fissure. They came not to mock, but to see, to learn. They saw her small, healthy flock, and when the spring came and the ewes gave birth to strong, bleating lambs, they understood. Ilara's 3 sheep, and their offspring, were now the most valuable animals in the entire region, the foundation from which the valley would have to rebuild. The nickname they had given her, Fisher Girl, did not disappear, but its meaning was transformed. It was now spoken with a tone of deep respect, even reverence. She was the girl who had understood the mountain, who had listened to the stone instead of to the foolish pride of men. Ilara did not hoard her success. She traded her new lambs fairly, not for coin, but for the things she needed: sacks of grain, better tools, bolts of warm wool cloth, a young cow for milk. Her uncle Thaddeus came to her, his face grim, his blacksmith's pride humbled. He needed to buy a ram to start his own flock anew. She sold him one at a fair price, the transaction clean and without a trace of malice. The injustice that had started her journey was simply a fact, like a stone in a field, and she had long since learned to plow around it.
Her methods began to change the very landscape of the valley. Farmers, rebuilding their lives, did not erect the same old wooden barns. They came to Ellada, and she taught them what she had learned. She showed them how to look for natural hollows, how to build with stone against a hillside, how to dig into the earth for protection. A new style of building emerged, half barn, half bunker, dug into the land itself. They called them fissure pens, and they were a testament to her legacy. Years passed. Ellada's home grew, not outwards, but deeper into the mountain. She expanded the chambers, added a root cellar, a smokehouse, all carved from the living rock. She never moved back to Providence. The fissure was her home, the mountain her truest neighbor. One evening, now a woman grown, she stood at the entrance to her shelter. At her side sat a great, shaggy dog, the grandson of Ronan. Below her, in the soft, fading light, her flock grazed peacefully on the greening slope. She was not a wealthy woman in the way the town understood it. She had no fine house, no grand title, but she was secure, her life woven into the fabric of the rock and the rhythm of the seasons. She had been given a worthless, broken piece of land. From that rejection, she had built not just a shelter, but a future. And in saving herself, she had shown a whole community how to survive. Her legacy was not written in any book of deeds or wills. It was written in stone, a quiet, enduring testament to the wisdom of what is discarded, and the strength of a woman who refused to be broken.